And so now we're finally at the part where we get to talk about risk. What we've already established is that there are some crimes it's okay to prohibit and to punish more harshly than just demanding bare restitution. So then the question is, what do we do with actions that pose a threat of causing a particular rights violation or a particular harm, but aren't 100% certain to cause that harm? And so this is why that last video was actually important and useful for answering this question. If it were the case that no crime should be prohibited, that when you commit a crime all you have to do is just make restitution back, well then no crime that poses a risk of violating rights but then fails to violate rights should have any penalty at all. Because since it failed to violate rights, you don't owe any sort of restitution. But since we already established in the last video, that hour-long monstrosity, that there are certain crimes that when you commit them, you owe something more than just recompense for the harm done, then it becomes plausible that there are certain things you could do that don't succeed in violating someone's rights, but because they have a chance of violating their rights in such a way that what you're doing should be prohibited, that you're still liable for some sort of punishment, even though you never actually violated rights. However, it's simply not as cut and dry as that. There are certain actions where the risk that they impose is so small that really if only one person did it, we wouldn't care. However, when a large number of people do it, the risk that some person is going to be harmed by it gets larger. The risks compound with one another. So the question is, what do we do with those? Do we stop the entire thing? What do we do in those particular situations? There are two particular examples that Nozick likes to use throughout this bit. One of them I'm going to replace with one that is going to give libertarians less trouble, because the first one, libertarians are just going to say, I have an easy answer for that. So I'll try to replace it with one that the answer isn't as easy and it's easier to see Nozick's point with. But one example is what I'm going to call the roulette man. So we have some guy who gets an enormous amount of pleasure by playing Russian roulette with people. So he just runs around with a gun that only has one bullet in it, points at people and pulls the trigger. Let's assume he never actually shoots anyone except maybe himself and causes severe injury to himself. Should what roulette man is doing, even if we know what he's doing and we know that there's a fairly low chance of you getting shot, suppose that the pistol has N chambers. It's got a lot of different chambers, not just 5 or whatever, so it's not a 20% chance of you getting shot. Let's say it's lower than that. But he gets pleasure out of this, running around, pointing at people, pulling the trigger, and no one else has consented to this. Do you have a right to stop him? Seems to most people that the answer is yes. Okay, what about, here's Nozick's other example, and I'll replace it with something in a moment. What about someone who is a narcoleptic and they fall asleep at somewhat random intervals and they want to drive a car? Is it okay to prohibit this person from driving a car? Now, the standard libertarian anarcho-capitalist response is going to be, well, someone is going to privately own the roads and they'll make the decisions about what the rules will be on the roads, and it's not as though you have an inherent right to drive a car, and so on and so forth. Let's put this example off to the side and come up with something that is clearly more analogous to the Russian roulette man. Let's say in your house you've started to do experiments in your basement. And the experiments you are doing in your basement, if you do them correctly, will result in a great product that you can sell at a cheap price. However, if you make a mistake, you're going to poison your neighbors. And let's say that the chances, and that your neighbors are going to get hurt and go to the hospital or whatever, let's say the chances of that are the same as the roulette man's chances. should you doing that in your garage be prohibited? Okay, maybe you say yes, maybe not. What about someone who owns a factory? And assuming everything goes right with the factory, no one's going to be hurt nearby, but if a mistake gets made, they might poison people as well, and there's a certain percentage chance of this. Right, you can see how these are all similar situations. The main one that I'm going to use is I'm just going to rip off the Coase theorem, and I'm going to use that example. Let's say that you have a train that owns a plot of land that the train goes on, and along the train track there are numerous farms that all grow wheat. If the train is operating correctly and appropriately, it shouldn't throw off a spark that sets fire to the wheat field. However, there is some chance that a spark will get thrown off and the wheat fields will burn. What do we do? Who does the right go to? Does the farmer, do they get to prohibit the train from doing their behavior that has a risk of violating the farm owner's rights? What does it, so Rothbard would say, it comes down to who was there first. He'd probably say something like that as his default answer. Let's assume they've both been there at the same amount of time, or so close to the same amount of time that you can't realistically say who was there first. Let's say they've both been there generations and generations, and the train runner wants to upgrade his train to a new model that's a lot faster, but slightly more likely, let's say 0.2% more likely to throw off a spark and set fire to the farmers' farms. Do the farmers have a right to prohibit the train person from doing that, or not? Right? Those are the sorts of questions here. Who gets to stop others from taking risk actions that pose a risk of violating someone else's rights? When do you get to do that, and when do you not get to do that? The hard part here is just, where's the bright line? We all think the Russian roulette man should be stopped. We probably have different intuitions about whether the train operator should be stopped, or the business owner with the business that has a risk of giving off a particular pollution that's going to harm people. Or, we have different intuitions about this, and it's not clear exactly where the line is. How great does the harm have to be in order to say we can prohibit this action? How great does the chance of something going wrong have to be? So like if the Russian roulette guy, who is, let's say it's not a gun and he's not pointing a gun at people, let's say he's just taking some behavior that has a 1 in 1 million chance of killing people, and a 999,999 in a million chance of not hurting them at all. Maybe he's dropping a little pill into their cup. He's got like a Russian roulette set of pills. It's a bad example too. Point is, there's clearly some line where doing whatever you're doing that imposes a risk is permissible and shouldn't be stopped, because everything everyone ever does has a risk of going awry and hurting someone else, and somewhere where it shouldn't be. But it's not at all clear where that line is, and natural rights theories don't usually have a well-developed, principled way to answer where that line goes. Doesn't mean we should throw them out. They just don't have those lines. So Nozick says, in general, it's going to be left up to whatever court system you have. And there are really 3 options they have for any particular rights violation. So, option 1, prohibit and punish the risky behavior regardless of whether or not it ever actually violates someone's rights. So just make it illegal, stop it, charge them the extra amount as if they had violated rights in the first place. Option 2, you permit the behavior as long as you require they pay anyone whenever they violate their rights. So you let the Russian roulette man fire the gun, but if they hurt someone, they pay all the medical bills twice over, or they pay the medical bills plus whatever you think the correct payment to be generally to deter that sort of thing would be, and so on. Train people, you have them pay the farmers if a fire goes off. Third and final possibility, you permit them to do what they're doing, but instead of requiring that they make the payment to whoever they happen to violate the rights of, they make the payment to everyone they impose a risk to. So the rights violation, or not rights violation, the behavior that risks violating rights is permitted, but everyone who takes on the risk of having their rights violated gets compensated by the person who is doing the risky behavior. So those are the three possible choices a court system could make when someone comes to them saying, hey, this person is doing something that runs a significant risk of violating my behavior. I want you to put a stop to it. The court can do one of those three options. Now, 2 and 3 seem really different, and some have they benefits over one another. So, for example, if you permit, if you do example 2, you permit it, but you require compensation whenever a boundary is crossed. You don't compensate people for fear, right? We talked about his fear argument that Nozick likes so much. He thinks, well, all these other people are undergoing the fear of it happening. They might be taking precautions to mitigate whatever damages may happen, but they never receive any benefits. Only the people who actually end up having their rights violated have their have compensation given, and everyone else deals with the fear. So one of the justifications for being able to prohibit this, I know we're saying that these are permitted now, but since we're still requiring compensation be paid, like there's still rights violations, one of the justifications, one of the things that they would have to pay more for isn't going to everyone. It's just going to the people whose rights are violated. So that's an issue with number 2. And number 3, where you make them pay to everyone, has the issue where when the harm eventuates on someone, that person is disproportionately affected. So you have a bunch of people who are benefiting because the harm never eventuated on them, the risk went unrealized, then you have a bunch of people who are losing out. So he gives the example of a little kid. They never got any benefit from the regular payments that are being made because they didn't live long enough to receive that benefit. So they didn't, even though they were harmed, so they didn't benefit at all. Nozick doesn't seem to mind so much which of these two you choose, because he points out that they can easily be transformed into one another by people who prefer one to the other. So take example 2, or take option 2, where you permit the activity as long as compensation is provided to everyone's boundary who's crossed. Well, people who prefer to be compensated ahead of time for their fear, to have the regular money coming in to compensate them for that, whether it ever happens to them or not, well, what they can do is they can get together and say, hey, I know I'm unlikely to ever get this payout. However, I'm going to sell the fact that if this ever happens to me, the payout won't go to me, it'll go to this bank. I'll sell them that right every year, and I'll get a payout every year. And so, of course, banks and financial institutions would buy that from some people, would buy the fact that, okay, if this ever happens to you, you're not going to get the money, the payout. We'll get it instead, but we're going to give you a small payment, some amount every year, depending on what interest rates are and all that, in order that when it does happen to this person or that person or the other person, we'll get the money then instead of them. And so that 2 can be transformed into 3, and similarly 3 can be transformed into 2. So in example 3, when you permit it happen, as long as you pay it out evenly to everyone who's taking on the risk, those people can all go buy insurance policies with the money they're given that say, okay, if the event eventuates on you, then you receive a payout. So one can be transformed into the other fairly easily, so he kind of collapses those down into one option. So the 2 options now are, we just stop it, you pay, we're going to fine you, try to stop you, deter you heavily, whether or not the action eventuates, or we permit it, but there is some fee charged to you either whenever a rights violation eventuates on someone or not. It seems some people can't afford to make either regular payments or payments out to people when something goes wrong. So do we just say those people can't start a train company, or they can't start a business? What do we do with those people who don't have enormous reserves in their back pocket to do the things that courts determine should be permitted, but that pose a risk to others? Let's say they don't have the money to buy the insurance so that if something goes wrong, there's a payout when they're sued. Do we just stop them from doing it? And if so, do we owe them anything? So there's something that we've said is permissible, but either when something goes wrong and it violates someone's rights, you have to pay out, or because of the fear you impose by doing something risky that may violate people's rights, you have to make out a regular payment to the people who you're running the risk of violating their rights. This person can't afford to do that. Are they simply not allowed to do the action? So he thinks there are some cases where the answer is just, yeah, they're not allowed to do it, and we don't owe them anything in return. But he thinks there are other cases, like his specific example with the epileptic driver, where that person is doing something that most normal people would usually do, but we are just saying you don't have the right to do that. And libertarians, to think about this not like the epileptic driver, where it's a situation where in your ideal society it would be a private road. Think of it as some other example where it's something that most people would normally do, and we're prohibiting someone from doing it because they have an above average chance, significantly above average chance, of violating someone else's rights, and they are unable to afford insurance to make it up to those people if they violate their rights, or they're unable to make compensation to those people if they violate their rights. And so we've just said, you can't do it. Do we have a responsibility to make it up to this person? We've stopped them from doing something that they would usually, most people would usually be entirely free to do, and we've said, you can't do it because some justified reason poses a risk of violating rights. Now he goes through a long thing about it's really hard to tell what things are the sorts of things normal people have to do, like earning a living. That's a really difficult thing for you to delimit. Is starting a lab in your garage to make plastic products, but the fumes may, if you make a mistake, poison your neighbors. Are we allowed to stop you from doing that because of the risk you risk imposing on others without paying you back? Nozick thinks that we should be able to stop you from doing that. Rothbard might disagree. But Nozick would say, yeah, we should be able to stop you from doing that, and we shouldn't have to pay you compensation because you have a wide range of other ways you could earn a living. Even if that way to earn a living would be your most profitable way to earn a living, there are still other avenues open to you. Nozick only thinks we should stop you if it's something that, if we're prohibiting you from doing something entirely. And he doesn't have a good bright line for this, and he admits he doesn't have a good bright line for this. He doesn't know. We shouldn't prohibit people from having fun, but we clearly should prohibit the roulette guy who's going around with the gun and pointing it at people. And probably should, even if that's the only way this particular individual can have fun, because most normal people, there are other ways they can have fun as well. However, if you were to prohibit someone from having any sort of fun because for them, for some reason, it imposed risks on others, then you probably would be required to compensate them for the burden you put on them. Quick side note, because Nozick spends like 2 or 3 pages on this side note, he isn't talking about pollution. He basically comes down on pollution exactly where Rothbard does. He uses the example of noise pollution with an airport. He thinks that whoever's there first has the rights. He thinks that if an airport comes in, starts noise polluting, people try to sue them, courts should require that the airport give the money to soundproof all the houses, pay to soundproof the houses, pay for whatever damages were done, and so on and so forth, until the people in the homes are up to snuff, whether they're back up to the point where they're saying, okay, it's worth it now. And ideally, what would happen is the airports would contract with people beforehand, and it wouldn't have to go through the court system. But in the case where it happens to go to the court system, then you have the courts enforce it. Nozick has another brief aside here where he talks about earlier, we said we shouldn't, in the case of theft, for example, we need to have the retributive scheme, right? Because we have the issue that I think is super important, where if you only require restitution, then it always benefits you to steal instead of to make a deal with someone, because then you just have to pay the minimum. In this case, Nozick thinks that would be justified, like the airport case and a lot of these risk cases, to just be on one end where the entire benefit of the transaction goes to one person. He doesn't think it's particularly bad if the airport comes in or the train comes in and they only pay what the bare minimum would have been to allow to the farmer, so that the farmer would let them drive through. He doesn't see, he has a big section that is a lot more convincing than you'd think it is on what he calls unproductive exchange, that I don't want to get into here because this video is already running really long. It's a really good section though, and I'm curious how Walter Block would respond to it, because it's got a lot to do with blackmail. Let's stay off that topic though, for now. So in these situations where we are requiring that the prohibitor pay the person prohibited from doing the risky behavior something to compensate them for stopping the behavior that posed a risk of violating the prohibitor's rights, that only happens in the cases where the prohibitors are willing to pay enough to compensate the person who is taking the risky behavior. And in cases where they don't value their additional security more than the money, they value their money more, the prohibition doesn't happen and the person gets to continue doing the risky behavior. So then the question becomes, well, when we prohibit risky behavior in these particular situations, what is it that makes us required to pay them to compensate them? Are we violating their rights? And if so, shouldn't we just not prohibit them? And if we're not violating their rights by prohibiting them, shouldn't we just be able to prohibit them without compensating them because we didn't violate their rights? Nozick has two answers, one of which I think is more interesting than the other, but I think he likes the one I think is less interesting more. The one I think is more interesting is to think about it this way. When we're prohibiting someone from taking a behavior that poses a risk of violating rights, we are actually violating their rights. However, prohibiting risky behavior is not a violation of rights that should be prohibited. It would fall into the class of behaviors that violate rights that should be permitted. So you violate their rights by prohibiting them from doing the risky thing, and then you're required to compensate them. But they're not in fear from you prohibiting them. You're just prohibiting them, and then you compensate them. So it's permitted, even though it's a rights violation, which we already established there should be at least some cases like that, where a rights violation is permitted, not prohibited. Other way of thinking about it, that he thinks might be right, that Nozick likes more than me, is, well, no, you have a right to prohibit them given that they paid compensation, right? He says it's not just, there are three possibilities, not two. Possibility one, it's a rights violation to prohibit them. Possibility two, it's not a rights violation to prohibit them. Possibility three, it is a rights violation to prohibit them if you don't pay compensation, but it is not a rights violation if you prohibit them and pay compensation. hopefully it's clear how this way of thinking of things might be applicable to our current debacle. And I say might. I think a lot of things with contagious diseases and pandemics can be solved quite easily through strict enforcement of private property rights. If you go to a store in a free market that does not require masks, you know you're taking a certain particular risk. And the store can post that, apprise you of whatever risks you're taking, and so it doesn't seem as though the store, by not having a mask policy, violates your rights. And I can think of a shit ton of reasons why most stores would have mask policies. By way of example, I can think of a ton of reasons why a lot of stores would temporarily close in situations like the one we face today, just simply through market forces. However, you can imagine situations where someone's actions in a situation like the one we face today, or maybe a mythological one that's a lot worse. Like, I'm not going to wade into what the actual level of contagiousness is, or any science or anything like that. I want to keep this purely academic and abstract. But you can imagine a situation where you have some weird disease. This is not at all scientifically accurate, but we can imagine a magical disease where when you step outside of your home, you run a 1% chance of randomly infecting someone else. Right? Just by stepping out of your house onto your outdoor lawn. Right? Or we can imagine a situation where normally hawking a loogie on a neighbor's yard doesn't have any chance of harming them and isn't something we would prohibit, but because of some particularly virulent disease, doing so does pose a significant risk of harming someone, let's say whether you know you're infected or not. Right? We can imagine situations like that, where normal behaviors become behaviors that risk violating other people's rights. And I think Nozick's schemata here provide us with a possible way of dealing with that. And I think, as opposed as I personally am to the bailouts that the federal government has done, I think you could absolutely see a situation wherein you would prohibit people from doing things that they would normally have a right to do and be completely within a libertarian legal framework. But by prohibiting them from doing something they normally have a right to do, you would incur a legal obligation to remunerate them for the damage caused to them by what would usually be a rights violation that your prohibition changed. Do I think the government is handling any of this at all correctly right now? No. They rarely handle anything correctly, and a ideal libertarian society would also probably screw almost everything up, even if I think it would screw almost everything up to a lesser extent than the current regime does. However, you can see how this would be applied and how some libertarians making arguments for certain courses of action that are similar to what the government has taken now might have a good libertarian legal framework leg to stand on. I hope you found this rambling spew informative and fun.